Good morning and welcome to Brooklyn Waterfront Research Center Breakfast Talk. We will be with you shortly. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for uh, attending another breakfast talk of the Brooklyn Waterfront Research Center. Again, we apologize that we have to do this virtually instead of offering you coffee and Danish as is our or had been our custom until this year. Uh, but we have another exciting program today. It's an interesting week uh, for African American history in New York in general and Brooklyn in particular. Uh, Weeksville, for instance, was cited as became the first Black city-funded cultural institution this week, which was an important development. But we're focusing not so much on Crown Heights today as on downtown Brooklyn. And the history of African Americans in downtown Brooklyn is our focus, whether it's the Underground Railroad, the suffrage movement. There is one of the ways of understanding history and having people know about it is to see it. And a way of seeing it is by preserving the places where that history occurred. And we have today two people who are going to be speaking to us about the history of downtown Brooklyn, about one of the places in downtown Brooklyn that can be a kind of nexus or a center for some of that important history. As we in City Tech are so close to this that it's important for us and our students to understand this and for the community at large. And so the act of historical preservation is the act of preserving history and understanding where we are as a borough, a city, a country. And before I introduce our guests, I would just like to point, I guess everyone's pretty much a veteran of Zoom webinars and Zoom meetings by now. So I see that people are using the chat function very well and introducing themselves. And I see a number of people here. Julia Jordan, hello to you. And I see the Dean of Liberal Arts School of City Tech is here. And so welcome to all of you, and thank you for coming. So the chat function, you can use it for various purposes as you see, but in terms of questions and answers for the for our speakers, I would direct you please to use the Q&A function, and the questions and answers will be addressed after both speakers make their presentations. And then we'll open it up for discussion. We will curate the questions, and we should have plenty of time for questions and discussion after the speakers make their presentations. I am the first speaker who will present for us is Suzanne Spellen, and I'm happy to welcome her to City Tech, to BWRC. She's from upstate New York, Gilbertsville in Otsego County. She came to New York to pursue a career in opera and in costume design. Now, when we hear the introduction to Raul, we'll see that he also has a musical background and might have come to New York with similar kinds of things. And here they are. But as she lived in Bed-Stuy, Suzanne became inspired by old house restoration, the history and architecture of the places where she was living, as well as the people in Brooklyn. She's a longtime board member now of the Crown Heights North Association, which has worked tirelessly on landmark and National Register designation for that neighborhood before the swirl of rezoning comes in, I guess. Suzanne's also a columnist for the blog The Brownstoner. She first started using the name Montrose Morris, and her expertise is in the architecture and history of central Brooklyn. Raul has been dedicated to promoting Duffield Street's unique and powerful history since he met Joy Monroe in 2004. If you don't know Joy Monroe, I guess you will hear about her soon. He came from San Francisco, and he moved to Brooklyn to complete his master's in musical theater. composition at the Tisch School at NYU. He plays a cello with Kakande, I'm sorry, a West African Rio-led band, and he plays bass with Electrifa Hungarian folk. So he's still engaged in his musical pursuits. He also is the co-president of the PS9 Parent Teachers Association. And he led the efforts to remove the school name of a slave-owning family. That's what the school was named for, and replace it with Sarah Smith Garnett, the first African-American woman principal in New York. And she was the co-founder of the first African-American women's suffrage club in the United States. We'll hear more about that. And he currently lives in Brooklyn and is the communications director for City Council member Robert Carnegie. And so, without further ado, I would welcome Suzanne to begin her presentation.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so glad to be here. And let me just try to share my screen. Can everyone see that? Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. So this short presentation in no way tells this whole story. And we're just going to be scratching the surface this morning of the story of Black Americans in 18th, 19th, and 20th century and 21st century Brooklyn. There are tales from all across Brooklyn that we could tell. This would be a course that would take several semesters to really go into in depth, but I've got 20 minutes. So I'm gonna whale through a whole lot of facts and names and people, and I'm keeping myself pretty much to Brooklyn Heights and downtown. But one thing I want to tell everyone and make known is that we were here, and by we, I mean Black people. We were here throughout the history of Brooklyn, and we were contributing, but we were almost invisible. We were part of the fabric of Brooklyn. We helped build Brooklyn, and we didn't get very much credit for it. We didn't show up just after the Civil War or during the Great Migration of the 20th century. We were not all hewers of wood or carriers of water. We were professionals with vital services, and some of us were lauded for our skills in medicine, the culinary arts, hospitality, education, as well as religious and legal oratory. So this presentation is just a hint of who we were, what we were doing, where we were, and how the importance of places like 227 Duffield fit into this whole history of African Americans in Brooklyn, and how it needs to be a part of not just Black history that gets wheeled out in February, but American history that should be taught to everyone all throughout the year. So let's start at the beginning. The Dutch brought the first African slaves to America in 1619. And I'll let you read this while I tell you some other facts. And because of all the farms in Kings County, Brooklyn was the slaveholding capital of New York. Black people worked the farms, they worked in around the homesteads, and no doubt they helped build some of Brooklyn's earliest houses, of which only a handful remain standing today. In the Lott house, for example, archaeologists found evidence that the Lott family housed their slaves in the attic of their homestead. And we're not talking about a La Boheme in a nice garret apartment. We're talking about, in this particular house in the picture, not where the dormers were, but above the dormers, in the attic. And it must have been freezing in the winter and stifling hot in the summer. It wasn't tall enough for people to fully stand upright. And not that they would have been hanging out up there anyway. They probably collapsed exhausted after a long day's work and had to get up before dawn to start working again. And unlike in the South with its slave quarters, most of Brooklyn's enslaved people would have lived in attics and cellars or in barns. Only a few lived better than that. Here's a bill of sale that for a Negro girl called Anna from Cornelius Cornell to the Laird Jan Lefferts from 1751. And census and records show that the numbers, names, and sales notices and receipts for Brooklyn's enslaved population, these records still exist. Many of them are in the Brooklyn Historical Society, and you can see that there was quite a rousing trade of Africans in the early part of American history in Brooklyn. This is a famous picture of early Brooklyn. This is Francis Guy's Winter Scene in Brooklyn, painted in 1819 to 1820, and it hangs in the Brooklyn Museum. And by 1801, Kings County had a population of 4,000 whites, 1,500 free blacks, and 330 slaves. And as late as 1820, when Francis Guy painted this street scene, only 55% of Brooklyn's Black population was free, compared to 95% of Manhattan's Black population. The other important thing about this slide is that we were here. There are Black people in this picture. It's hard to discern, but if you look to the right, bottom right, you see the man leaning on the shovel, shoveling coal. He's African American, and perhaps the child behind him looking at the man who fell in the snow, he may be African American. It's really hard to tell. But the most important thing is that in the background, in the left of the painting, you have that white building with the sign on it, right behind the horse and cart. That was a restaurant, and it was called Johnny Joe's. It opened a little after this portrait was painted, but it opened in 1825, and Johnny Joe was a Black man, and this was a very popular restaurant in early Brooklyn. So Black folks are on record as living near Fulton Ferry. You have to remember at this time, all of Brooklyn was basically around Fulton Ferry. And we were employed as butchers and cooks, artisans, dressmakers, potters, boot blacks, shoe repairmen, everything. We did a little of everything. And we owned property. The first Black man in the village of Brooklyn to buy a home was James Ash. There was a Black doctor named Gilbert Gilbertus. And there were people like Peter and Benjamin Kroger, who became important figures in Brooklyn's abolitionist movement. Peter and Benjamin Kroger established Brooklyn's first African school, and they had a whitewashing business. That was, whitewash was a white paint used on just about every building, and they had quite a good business there. And the great thing I like about this illustration is that, yep, we're here too. You can see there's a Black man in the very far left corner standing there looking across the street. This was a notice that was in the Brooklyn papers for Peter Kroger's school. It was on James Street, which no longer exists. The community of free Black people in Brooklyn at that time lived in what was the Second Ward, which was bounded by Bridge Street, Sand Street, Fulton Street, and the East River, and all parts of Dumbo now. And most of it's either warehouses and big loft buildings or roads and ramps leading across the Manhattan and Brooklyn bridges. Two brothers, Peter and Benjamin Kroger, lived here. They were born free in Manhattan, and both of them were involved in anti-slavery activity, and both were listed as preachers and class leaders in the AME church. Peter opened his first school, as I said, in 1815, and this was because schools were segregated. There was a small public school in the neighborhood, but Black children were not allowed to attend. And Pearl Street is probably about in the middle of that building on the right now. It's totally gone. So let's talk about abolitionist Brooklyn for a minute. And this sort of sets up the 227 Duffield House, and all the activity that takes place primarily in the early to mid part of the 19th century. One of the most important people in this movement was this man. This is Sylvanus Smith. He lived from 1831 to 1911, had a wonderfully long life. He was 80 when he died. He was a hog farmer and a hog driver. He drove his hogs to market and made a pretty good living. He was one of the original landowners in Weeksville, along with a man named Henry C. Thompson. And they bought their land from the Lefferts family in Bedford and divided it up into smaller lots. And they sold those lots specifically to African Americans, in part because they knew that this would be a place where African Americans could determine their own destiny, live amongst other African Americans, start businesses, churches and other institutions, and basically be left alone to determine their own destinies. And also because land purchase of over $250 would assure them that they could vote. At this point, African-American men, because only men could vote, were not generally allowed to vote unless they were landowners. There was an 1821 law written in New York State specifically to obscure the Black vote. You couldn't just be a free man over 21 and vote. You had to be a free Black man over 21 with $250 worth of land. So in addition to settling their own community, land ownership in Weeksville or anywhere meant that Black men could vote. And we all know how important voting is. Sylvanus Smith sat on the board of trustees of the African Free School, which eventually became Colored School number 1 in Weeksville. He was also, in Fort Greene. He was also trustee of the Citizens Union Cemetery in Weeksville. He was an ardent abolitionist and a member of several benevolent societies and other organizations. And he and his wife, Anne Springfield Smith, were parents of 11 children, 7 of whom lived to adulthood. The eldest of these was Sarah Smith Tompkins Garnett, who was, as mentioned, the first African-American female school principal, a lifelong educator and champion of women's suffrage. And her younger sister was Dr. Susan Smith McKinney Stewart, who was the first African-American woman to receive a medical degree in New York State, and only the 3rd African-American woman in the entire country. She was the co-founder of the Brooklyn Women's Homeopathic Hospital and Dispensary, which served the African-American community. She did postgraduate education at Long Island Medical College, and she practiced at the Brooklyn Home for the Aged Colored People, where she was also a board member. She practiced at New York Medical College and Hospital for Women in Manhattan, and she specialized in prenatal care and childhood diseases. She was a lecturer and very respected woman and an accomplished public speaker and women's suffrage advocate along with her sister. So Sylvanus Smith had quite a family. So we weren't just sitting around waiting for other people to help us out. We were helping ourselves out. There were a lot of organizations, especially in the early part of the 19th century, that were specifically designed to aid Black people in Brooklyn with getting a leg up on life. There was the Brooklyn African Women's Benevolent Society, which was one of the first. That was founded in 1810. And Woolman was Thomas Woolman. He was a Quaker abolitionist in Pennsylvania who helped a lot of people attain freedom. And so in honor of him, the society was named after him. There were other organizations. There was the Brooklyn African Tompkins Society, named for a similar man named Tompkins. That one was founded in 1827. There was the Brooklyn Colored Temperance Society, founded in 1831. And there were the Prince Hall Masons, who were founded in 1849. By 1906, there were at least 12 Black fraternal organizations in the borough. There was also a place called African Hall, which was a meeting place on Nassau Street on the downtown Dumbo border. And all these organizations were important because they helped people pool their resources. The members were able to provide some sort of insurance. They were able to provide burial insurance, which is really important because a lot of people couldn't afford to have themselves buried after they died. So if you belonged to one of these organizations, they would make sure that you had a good funeral and you were buried in the cemetery with a stone, as opposed to stuck in Potter's Field somewhere. They helped people save money. They helped people save money to buy homes. They just provided a sense of what all these organizations, Black or white or any kind, provide, which is a sense of community and belonging to something larger than yourself, with a goal of helping not only yourself, but other members of your community. So they were very important to at a time when people in other states were not free. So this is just so important. The photograph here is of Marichka Lyons. She's also important. She's a little later in the movement, but she was also in the education. She taught in public schools in Brooklyn for 48 years and was the second Black woman to serve in the system as an assistant principal. And in 1892, she co-founded the Women's Loyal Union of New York and Brooklyn, which is one of the first women's rights and racial justice organizations in the United States. She was a good friend of Ida B. Wells, and they worked on anti-lynching programs. And she was just another one of those unsung heroines of American history. So after the family, the Black church was the most important organization during the 19th century, and Black congregants were segregated to the balconies of white churches at that time, specifically in the Sand Street Methodist Church, which was on Sand Street, right around where the ramp starts that goes over the Manhattan Bridge. That was one of the largest and most important Methodist churches in Brooklyn during the early part of the 19th century. Black people were allowed to go there and sit in the church, but they were charged for the privilege, and they were segregated to the balcony. They weren't allowed to participate in the worship services, so that means they couldn't come down from the balcony for communion or laying on of hands or whatever was going on in the church. They were not allowed to be on any of the committees or in the choir or the vestry. And the worst thing was they had to sit up there, pay for it, and listen to the minister give pro-slavery sermons. And that was it for them. They were like, why are we doing this? Let's found our own church. So they broke off and founded the first African Wesleyan Methodist Episcopal Church, and other Black Protestant denominations followed. Baptists, all kinds of Methodists, Presbyterians, Anglicans, everybody founded their own church. And Concord was one of the churches that was also in downtown Brooklyn. It was founded by a group of Black Baptists who had been making the journey across the river every Sunday morning to worship at Abyssinian Baptist Church, which was at the time located in Lower Manhattan. And their first, they got tired of that too, and they founded their own church. The first church was in someone's home, and eventually they moved on and were able to raise money and move on to other churches before getting their own larger church on Concord. And Samson Wright was their first pastor. He's the gentleman on the lower left there. And he was a fugitive from the South. He was an escaped enslaved person, and he made his journey up to New York. He was educated, became a minister, and was Concord's first pastor. But in 1850, when the fugitive slave law was enacted, he got word that the slave catchers knew about him because he was so vocal, and they were going to come and get him and drag him back down south. So he left his position and escaped further north and made it to safety. And he was replaced by the other gentleman in the picture, who was Leonard Black. And Reverend Black and all the ministers who came after him were very involved in either the abolitionist movement or after the war in Black self-help organizations within the church, and were fiery advocates for Black rights. This church was very active in the Underground Railroad and the abolitionist movement. And again, all of these churches that were founded in downtown Brooklyn eventually moved to Bedford-Stuyvesant. About to be photobombed by my cat, excuse me. Okay, so here's a map that I drew up on Google, which shows a lot of the activity going on in Dumbo, Brooklyn Heights, and downtown Brooklyn by African Americans. Of course, I couldn't put everything on here, but this just a few points that that I wanted to point out. And you've got churches over about in the middle in downtown Brooklyn. You can see how many churches there were, homes, businesses, all kinds of organizations. There was a lot of activity going on in this general area, which at the time made up the city of Brooklyn. And here is some two excerpts from the 1886 map of downtown Brooklyn. And you can see that on the far left there, the Black churches were very close to one another and were pretty substantial organizations. You had First AMEZ on the far left, Silo Presbyterian Church in the middle, and Concord Baptist Church on the right on the first half of the slide. Holy Trinity became Concord or right after this map was made. And a few blocks away on Bridge Street, you had Bridge Street AME. And so this was just, downtown was where Black people lived. All of these churches moved to Bedford-Stuyvesant either before or after World War II. So some of the people working in the abolitionist movement, and the most famous one of all is, of course, Henry Ward Beecher. And Beecher was a fascinating individual. There's been a couple of books written about him. There should be a couple movies or something at least, because he was quite the character. He was one part Cotton Mather and one part P.T. Barnum, and he was 100% devoted to the cause of ending slavery. And he raised money, and both he and his congregation knew exactly where a lot of this money was going. They knew it was going to buy guns and ammo for people like John Brown and others fighting in states like Kansas. And the rifles that were bought with the money that he raised were called Beecher's Bibles. And so that was just how serious he was about the obliteration of slavery. He was best known for what this picture shows, which were his slave auctions. He found these young, beautiful girls who were, as you can see from this picture, more white looking than Black, pretty girls with light skin, long hair. And but they had enough Black blood in them that a couple of them were actually enslaved. And he would bring them up there and auction them off to the audience. And this was such a theatrical event. They had this, pretty helpless girl standing there being auctioned. He used language that most people would not have used at the time in describing her. And you can see from this picture, the men are on their feet, women were crying, and the money was flowing. People would put their jewelry in the collection plate. They just dumped money in the collection plate. And the good thing is they always raised enough money to free these girls if they were still in slavery. And he raised a lot of money for the cause. So you gotta kind of wonder, the cynic in me wonders if he would have had the same reaction if he had had a dark-skinned a very Black African looking woman standing up there instead of a girl who looked like their daughters, but he appealed to what he knew would work for them. He told them, this could be your daughter. Would you want your daughter to be ogled at by the eyes of men who had, you know, intentions upon her? And it worked. It was very effective. And he raised a ton of money. Another anti-slavery advocate were the Tappan family, and they were extremely wealthy and gave a lot of money to various forms of abolitionist and anti-slavery activity. They supported the publication of anti-slavery journals, and they helped support Oberlin College in Ohio, which admitted Black and white students equally. They supported the crew of the Amistad during the trial in Brooklyn. As Brooklyn's anti-slavery movement intensified, Black Brooklynites formed their own organizations to fight against the enslavement of Black people in the South, and they were often allied in principle with white abolitionist organizations, and many of them had the same goals, but amazingly, or perhaps not so amazingly, the two groups existed side by side and didn't really interact with each other that much. That's one of the amazing things about how this all worked out. Some of the great figures of the day, such as Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman and John Brown, they could move between the groups. They were equally comfortable talking to white abolitionist groups as they were talking to Black abolitionist groups. But the leaders of the Black groups rarely met with the leaders of the white groups. They often had very different goals and very different ways of going about what they were doing. And in a way, there's a big difference between anti-slavery groups and abolitionist groups. And it's not just, the terms are used sort of either or, but there really was a difference. A lot of wealthy white people were members of anti-slavery groups, even back before slavery was abolished in New York State in 1827. You had a lot of wealthy bankers and people whose fortunes were really dependent upon slavery because they were investing in the plantations in the South, and they were investing in the ships that brought the cotton up north to the mills. And so their fortunes really depended on Black labor, but they were also, as we call it today, quite woke. They didn't want to be associated with the horrors of slavery. So a lot of them joined anti-slavery groups and, you know, tut-tutted about how awful it was that people were in bondage, but it didn't, you know, they weren't really going to get involved in it any further than that. It was just a thing that you did. Oh yes, I'm in the anti-slavery whatever group. But people like the Tappans and some others, William Lloyd Garrison, people like that, they were abolitionists. And abolition means the abolishment, the end of slavery. They were not interested in the splitting hairs between whether or not, you know, they could still profit from it and tut about it, or isn't it awful that those people are in slavery? Here's $5. They were for the end of slavery. And these were the people who made the largest difference, both Black and white. One of the greatest families operating at this time were the Gloucesters. And I wish we had a photograph or a painting or a drawing of Elizabeth Gloucester, because she was a powerhouse. But she and her husband lived in downtown Brooklyn. They were one of the most important and wealthiest Black families in Brooklyn. The letters that were written between John Brown and Elizabeth and James Gloucester are now in the Brooklyn Historical Society, and they reveal a really close friendship between the Gloucesters and John Brown. These people were fiercely abolitionist. And in 1858, John Brown came to New York City to speak and raise money to arm his army to end slavery. And he stayed with the Gloucesters for a week, and he cemented their friendship. They gave him money for the cause, and they gave him a note that said, quote, "Do battle with that ugly foe, slavery." And the Brooklyn Eagle related that the last conversation Elizabeth had with John Brown, he said, "Goodbye, Sister Gloucester. I've only 16 men, but I'm to conquer." And she said to him, "Perhaps you will lose your life." "Well," he said, "my life isn't worth much. I'm an old man. In Kansas, the balls flew around my head as thick as hail. I'll never be killed by a ball. If I fall, I'll open a ball in this country that will never stop until every slave is free." And then he left New York, went to Harper's Ferry, and into history. Elizabeth was, as I said, an amazing woman. She was one of the strongest financial supporters of the Weeksville Howard Orphan Asylum and the Zion Home for the Aged, both in Weeksville. She sat on the governing boards of both institutions. She made sure all 6 of their children were college educated, most of which took place at Oberlin College. And when she died in 1883, her funeral was actually covered by the Brooklyn Eagle. Now, the Brooklyn Eagle is a whole nother story about how they covered Black people, and usually it wasn't good. But in this case, they came to her funeral, probably out of curiosity, and her funeral was here at the Remsen House. And newspapers from all over the world wrote about the remarkable, quote, colored woman who was the richest woman of her race. Her life story and accomplishments were spread across the world, with stories appearing as far away as New Zealand and Australia. And the funeral was elaborate and beautiful and attended by Brooklyn's Black and white elite. And the Eagle noted, quote, "The flowers filled the room with an abundance of fragrance and the heavy odor of the day. Lily was mixed with the delicate perfume of the tea rose. In the handsome silver-mounted casket rested all that remained of the late Mrs. Elizabeth Gloucester, the calm, dark face of the deceased coming in strong contrast to the white satin cushion around it. Gathered in the elegant apartment was a congregation of people as seldom before have come together in Brooklyn. It was made up of richly dressed white ladies, fashionably attired gentlemen, and a number of well-known colored people of this city and New York." I would love to write a book about the Gloucesters. I think they're absolutely fascinating people. And I did find out, I wrote the story originally for Brownstoner a couple of years before the New York Times wrote an obituary of Elizabeth Gloucester. And at that time, I was able to be in contact with a couple of their distant descendants. And so there are still Gloucesters around. So it'd be a fascinating story. Another fascinating story is that of David Ruggles, seen in the center of this picture. The 1830s were a really frustrating time for the abolitionist movement. We always hear about the later part of the movement after 1850, after the Fugitive Slave Act, but around 1830, it was kind of a tough time because slavery had ended in New York State in 1827, and about 5, 6, 7, 8 years later, there was a lot of anti-slavery activity, but it wasn't getting anywhere. They were publishing pamphlets and putting out flyers and giving speeches, and they were basically preaching to the choir, and nobody was really doing anything. And meanwhile, people were escaping from the South with a regularity that was really starting to scare Southern officials. And people like Frederick Douglass were escaping north, and not only were just escaping, they were turning around and becoming incredibly eloquent and compelling advocates for the end of slavery. So people like David Ruggles decided that, you know, enough is enough. And now was time to put your feet to the road and really start to do something. And so in retaliation to that, slave catchers were flooding into places like New York to recapture escapees. And a lot of the times they would just come and snatch people up off the street, sort of the way Solomon Northup, well, exactly the way Solomon Northup was abducted in the famous story of 12 Years a Slave. They could grab any Black person, say that they were an escapee. The Black people had no rights in defending themselves or proving that they were not who the slave catchers said they were. And they were often sent right back to slavery or into slavery when they were not slaves before. So Ruggles, his was what he called practical abolition, and they would directly confront people, and he would tell them if they had Southerners would come up to New York to do business with the banks and whatnot, and if they had their servants with them, they would confront them, tell the servants that you're in New York City, you're in New York State. There's no slavery here. You're free. You can leave. And they would help them escape. And that, of course, did not go over well with the slaveholders, but Ruggles and his practical abolitionists got very good at it. And one famous case in 1837, Ruggles exposed a Brooklynite named David Stanford as a Southern slaveholder who had a home in New York. And he was a devout Methodist church member. And Ruggles and his friends got him kicked out of the church. The man was the Brooklyn director of the Brooklyn Savings Bank. And he was so embarrassed by the coverage that he went back south. And one of the people that Ruggles saved, one of the escapees that Ruggles saved, was a young man named Frederick Augustus Bailey. And he arrived in New York City penniless and hungry. And he went to Ruggles for help. He was told by some sailors at the pier that Ruggles would help him. He went to Ruggles, and Ruggles was able to contact him with Anna Murray, the free woman who had encouraged his escape. And that man changed his name to Frederick Douglass and went on to history. So this is just a short list of some of Brooklyn's abolitionists and anti-slavery advocates. All of the names on the left side are African-American, and the people on the right side were Caucasian. So you had quite just as many. And of course, I've left many people on both sides out of this list. There just wasn't enough room or time or to tell their stories. But you can see that there were quite a few people on the left, quite a few Black people taking their own freedom and the freedom of people into their own hands. And I'm going to end now with just a look at what downtown Brooklyn was like for the people living here during the time period we're talking about. This picture is Lawrence Street between Fulton and Willoughby. And it's typical of what downtown Brooklyn looked like before you had all the large department stores, before you had the theaters and the banks and all of the things that makes downtown Brooklyn and Fulton Street particularly what it is today. The side streets and the main streets were largely residential or a mixture of residential and commercial. And Lawrence Street, you can see the difference between then and now. Those buildings are still here, and that's also true on Duffield. Bridge Street, Duffield, Gold, Lawrence, Prince Street, all those side streets that are in downtown Brooklyn now all looked similar to this. This is Willoughby at Pearl Street, and we don't have too many pictures from those days because, I don't know, nobody took them. This was the neighborhood where many of Brooklyn's African Americans lived, along with the Irish and other groups, and just ordinary people and of every group. And these were buildings that eventually became rundown and seedy and were all torn down either for urban renewal projects or for highways and on-ramps and bridges. And this particular scene is actually the dead-end block near Metrotech. And today the Friends School, which was the former Brooklyn Law School, is about mid-block where you see the storefronts. So Brooklyn has certainly changed in all these years. and we come to the Duffield Street and Truesdale House. This is a map from 1855 on the left, and you can see Duffield Street. You can see, first of all, that downtown Brooklyn was quite built up, and all of the pink buildings are masonry houses, and all of the yellow buildings are wood-framed houses. So Duffield Street between Fulton and Willoughby was entirely residential with a mixture of wood-framed houses and masonry buildings. And you can see from the picture on the right, which was taken in 1910, it was still very much the same. And the Duffield House 227 is there with the arrow.
Thank you. So,
one last slide.
okay.
So, and I just wanted to end with this quote, and this picture is of the Johnson Street houses, which was another side street that were moved when Metrotech was built. Forest City Ratner moved all of these houses to Duffield Street. It's about a block, it's on the next block before you get to 227. And again, these are all typical of the kinds of buildings that made up downtown Brooklyn. So that's what I got.
All right. Thank you, Suzanne. And to everyone, we are recording this so that, and it will be on our website if you want to see it, any additional information. For that last photo that you had, Suzanne, with those houses that were removed when Metrotech was being built, one of those houses was owned by a professor at City Tech. And it was interesting. She fought for a while to try to keep her home there, but the agreement was that they actually moved the house. Then she took the money they offered and went to Iowa, where she spent the rest of her days and retired. And we did, from the windows of City Tech, we actually saw the trucks moving those buildings, which was quite a sight. Wish we had cell phones with cameras in them then, because unless someone happened to have a camera in their room, it went unrecorded. So thank you very much. And now you brought us to Duffield Street and the neighborhood, and we'll segue to Raul now. Thank you.
All right. Hi, everyone. I want to thank you, Suzanne. You really were a lot of a great inspiration for me. I started reading Montrose Morris and the Brownsteiner years ago, and it's such a great way to tell the story of this history, because it's all around us, but like, how do you get people excited about it? And like, looking at buildings is a great way to do that. And so, you know, I think it's a struggle here to figure out how to tell the story, and you're a great model for me. So thank you for all that you've done. Maybe I'll just start off a little bit with those buildings that were moved on to Duffield right by Metrotech. They're basically sitting there kind of useless right now. They were preserved, but then they've been neglected since then. And I think an important part of this story is, you know, we can't rely on, you know, Metrotech and the Economic Development Corporation and Forest City Ratner to preserve this history. It really is everyone here who's doing a good job in doing that. So I also want to thank everyone for being here, because you know, when I listen to academics, they're off in their own world. They're studying all this stuff, the archaeology stuff, but they need us, everyone here, to really make it relevant to other people's lives and to push that. You know, we're very lucky to have saved 227 Duffield. Hold on, I'm going to try to time myself. We were really, I would say, lucky to preserve Duffield. There's so many other stories out there that need to be preserved. And even here on the chat, people have been telling stories of other things that are really equally worthy of preservation. I mean, we've lost so much, and it's nice to know that we have this community of people that have been supporting each other. A lot of the people from Manhattan, the Hopper Gibbons house, the Bowery folks, they have been incredibly supportive and come to support Duffield in times that we needed it. So I want to start with some big, bold statements, which is that New York City, this is great that we have this abolitionist African-American history. New York City was the financial capital of the slave trade. New York City nearly seceded, well, not nearly, but the mayor wanted to secede from the United States in order to continue trade with the South. My daughter goes to Dock Street School, that's Dock Street in Dumbo. Where do you think those docks were trading with? They were selling goods made by enslaved people in the South and in the Caribbean. We have so much around us, reminders of the Southern slave system and the Brooklyn slave system. And I think it's also important to remember that these people were a small minority who fought against it, that the financial wealth of this city really started with this trade with the South. So our riches, we don't have the Confederate flags flying so much in New York City. We don't need that reminder of the Southern slave system. We have these skyscrapers that were built on a system that was created by wealth created by enslaved people. The other thing that I think is really important is that right now, when you think of the civil rights movement, people think of Martin Luther King, Frederick Douglass. They're these big names, but we don't really dig that deep. They were part of a bigger network. And we think of the civil rights movement, we think of the 60s, we may think of the Harlem Renaissance, going to the 1910s, 1920s. There's this whole century of activism in the 19th century. And before that, I don't, I've yet to really dig deep into the 18th century stuff. But the 19th century had this whole century of activism that is kind of forgotten. We have like a couple names, and they were incredibly brave. The fact that we had the first Black women's suffrage club in Brooklyn and in Lower Manhattan, like every school student should know that. Like the women's suffrage movement was a lot of times proudly white supremacist and very racist. So the fact that there are these other women who were working on Black suffrage is an incredibly important part of the American story, the incredibly important part of the story of the 19th Amendment. We just celebrated the passage of the 19th Amendment last year, which gave women the right to vote, or most women the right to vote. The fact that the contribution of these Black women was not really celebrated in Brooklyn, like you would think we're all progressive, that we would celebrate all this stuff. It's been kind of neglected. So my goal here is to completely change the narrative, to completely say, if you're going to come to New York City, if you're going to come here from whatever, Australia or France, come to downtown Brooklyn. This is as important as the Statue of Liberty. The contribution of these people are super important, and they need to be celebrated. Wow, that was my big, bold statement that I was going to say 5 minutes on, and it took my 5 minutes already. So let me go into the Truesdales. So Thomas and Harriet Truesdale lived at 227 Duffield from 1851 to about 1862. It's funny now, there's such a connection to this history, but there actually isn't a whole lot of discussion on who they were or what they did. And they're described of as prominent abolitionists, and they were and they weren't. They were not. Frederick Douglass and Henry Highland Garnet were around giving speeches around the country, and they were a little bit more just part of the community. I think this is something that's important to also celebrate, people like this, slightly more normal people, who were not the Henry Ward Beecher, who had a whole church designed to focus on him and his story. These were people who did the work. So let me go a little bit into their history. So they're really, I think they're actually, I think Thomas was born in, was born in Connecticut, but they spent a lot of their lives in Providence, Rhode Island. They were married born in around 1790, around then, and they were married at the First Baptist Church. So again, you had, even in Rhode Island had some, real respect for, actually Rhode Island, I think, did not want to sign the Constitution, or they didn't want to sign sign on to the Bill of Rights because they didn't think it went far enough. So there was really some pretty radical activism in Providence and in Rhode Island, and they were kind of part of that scene. So they were, the Truesdales were, Thomas Truesdale was the distributor of the William Lloyd Garrison's paper. So they were co-founders of some of the really early abolitionist movements. And Suzanne mentioned that there was kind of a struggle, like these people in the 1830s and 1840s, like the movement didn't quite go anywhere. So it's, there's almost like a different movement when you hit the 1850s, but the Truesdales were really part of both, which is one thing that is also kind of unique to them. So they were very active over there. They moved around 1837, 1838. There was a financial collapse around then. So they probably moved because of that. I think they had a bank that they founded and that wasn't doing that well. So they moved to Brooklyn and got involved with some things. But one thing I want to mention, so when we think about the scope of American history, like one of the important dates is the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention, really is considered as the launch of the women's movement. But the history goes back even further. And there's so one of the things, there's many divisions within the abolitionist movement, the Garrisonians versus the Tappans, how much of this is about spreading, the gospel, and how much, but one of the other divisions was that women were not allowed in the abolitionist movement. So they started their own movement, which, and their first meeting was in New York City, 1837. The second meeting was 1838 in Philadelphia. So Harriet Truesdale was an officer of that meeting. And I'll share a document with you that in Philadelphia, they have historical resources in Philadelphia talking about how this meeting of women, black and white women at Philadelphia Hall in 1838 was very dramatic. First of all, because you had black and white women meeting together. And that got people so angry that a crowd of pro-slavery people burnt down the hall when these women were in this. I mean, there were some men too, I think they were allowed, but here it was 1838. 1838, these black and white women were walking out of this burning hall, hand in hand, arm in arm, and Harriet Truesdale was one of those women. One of the things I do want to mention, there was a discussion recently about suffragists, and somebody asked, like, how were these groups organized? And there was kind of a feeling that, oh, they just kind of got together. It's like, no, these were very, very intentional groups. They, if they had a picnic, there would be a committee for it. This Convention of Women in 1837, they had all sorts of committees that were involved. This was a very a lot of it was very formal in their activism. And hold on a second. I think that's something also just a misconception that we might have about that time, that they just kind of did it. And even Suzanne mentions all these churches. Like, this is a pretty amazing thing. I had a memory of in college, I had a professor who talked a lot about Machiavelli, and one of Machiavelli's statement was, the most important thing you could do is found a religion. And so he put Moses as one of the most important figures of human history. And I would say these people who founded these churches would are really basically up there too. These churches were not just religious, very important religious institutions, because the Christian church was very much supportive of the slave system. If anybody here is, we just had Passover. There was, I'm Jewish, and my Jewish activist friends are very proud of their activism, leftist activism. But even like a church, a synagogue, B'nai Jeshurun, actually, the rabbi there spoke out in favor of slavery. So, that religion was part of the tool of oppression, and it was a part of the tool of liberation too. So, and one thing I just also really want to emphasize that Suzanne mentioned, like a lot of these churches, I think there's some in Crown Heights. The Berean church is in Crown Heights. So they're not all, I want to give Crown Heights. I know we have some CB8 people here, so I give a little credit to Crown Heights too. But they still exist. This tradition is still alive in these churches. Okay, so getting back to the Truesdales, one of the other things that I think are important to mention is we focus on the Underground Railroad. And I was looking at so 227 Duffield got landmark designation by the Landmarks Preservation Commission. But if you look at it, it talks only about the connection to the Underground Railroad and abolitionists. I think one way that this history is destroyed is how you frame the discussion. So the way that 227 Duffield was originally wanted to be demolished was the city said, oh, it's not connected to the Underground Railroad. But that's not the only thing that was important. These churches, the literary societies that were there, the suffrage groups, the temperance movement was also very much connected to feminism. I mean, we think of it as, kind of this crazy kind of maybe quasi right-wing thing. But, another way to look at it is to say, okay, we're going to remake society. We're going to get rid of this thing that is part of this thing where men beat up their wives and get into fights and shoot each other and, do all these horrible things. So temperance was really also an idea of trying to transform society. So two other things that I want to mention about Thomas Truesdale is that he was also involved in these utopian communities. Again, this idea of totally remaking society. And after Brooklyn, he moved to New Jersey. So there were these basically communes. I found something recently where the Brooklyn Eagle called them, communist societies or something. So he was involved in that. Again, a way to remake society. And Thomas Truesdale was also involved in selling free cotton. So cotton that was not made with slave labor. So there were people who were really trying to remove themselves from a system of enslavement. And just one more general thought that I want to mention. So we think of history as being more and more rights for more people as time goes by. That didn't always happen. You had 1821 new restrictions on voting for African Americans. We renamed my kid's school Tunis Bergen. Here he was a congressman who voted against the Civil Rights Act of 1866. He voted many times to increase restrictions on voting rights for African Americans. So the property qualifications, if you were an African American, you want to vote, First, it was you had to own $250, and then they raised it. So there was a lot of movement to remove rights for African Americans throughout the 19th century. And then these things continued into the 1890s, into the lost cause movement of this thing idealizing the Southern slave system. This very much continued into the 1920s. So we always had this conflict, and the Truesdales were really, they were always, as far as I can tell, always on the side of what was right. So I made this big presentation. So I'm still working on how to discuss all this stuff. So I'm just gonna fly through this to give some visual representation. Let me do my share screen. Okay, here we go. Let me get this. Second. My apologies. Hold on a second, this is not working. Having a little problem with my share screen.
Raul, there should be at the bottom of your computer, the green.
Yeah, it wasn't, some things wasn't working here. So let me just, okay, I think it's working now. All right.
Yep, there it goes. All right.
So here is, I had a bunch of these slides that I made a couple years ago. Back in 2003, so now I'm going into the history of how we saved 227 Duffield. Back in 2003, Joy Chattel, living at 227 Duffield, and a bunch of other properties got these notices that their homes were going to be confiscated and demolished to build this little park. So we had a whole that, if you've, it's kind of hard to miss the change of downtown Brooklyn. Huge skyscrapers, some, I think we're going to be having some as tall as 76 stories. You have a bunch of 40-story buildings. These did not happen by accident. This was all based in, really got the go-ahead in the 2004 downtown Brooklyn rezoning. So a lot of this, the fight over history is also a fight over development. So New York City decided, yeah, it was the Economic Development Corporation, really kind of, it wasn't New York City, it was these backroom deals essentially decided to completely transform downtown Brooklyn. And part of that plan was so they wanted to throw up all these skyscrapers, 50-story buildings, and they had an idea, since they're going to destroy so much of basically all of these 19th century buildings, they wanted to have massive density. They wanted to have a little tiny park. And originally it was going to be an underground parking lot. And so they put a note under Joy's door, but a bunch of other buildings also got these notices. And this is when the fight started. So this is when we said you can't destroy it because it's part of the Underground Railroad. So in response, the Economic Development Corporation, which is this quasi-private, quasi-public organization, spent $500,000 of taxpayer money on this study, basically justifying the destruction of this history. And so part of it is they framed the question as, were these buildings part of the Underground Railroad? Which is a very difficult thing to prove. And again, what's important is not necessarily that they're part of the Underground Railroad, but that they were part of the story of Brooklyn and the liberation of Brooklyn. So they did this study, but they didn't have any historians on staff. This is an environmental review company, basically. And so they hired a bunch of academics to kind of bolster their reports. And they put all of these the statements of these reports in the appendix. And so in this document the executive summary, which they presented to the city council, said there is not sufficient evidence at this time to save these properties. And that was the top end thing. You had to go to Appendix B to find these statements. So I'm just sharing a couple of these things here. Judith Wellman is one of the quotes. She was the one who developed this idea of rating sites on of whether they are part of the Underground Railroad, and she found 227 Duffield to be a very likely spot on the Underground Railroad. We had some other academics here, but I also want to mention Dr. Cheryl LaRoche. So she has written extensively on the Underground Railroad around the country, and she thought 227 Duffield was, she called it the most promising site for Underground Railroad research in the country. So part of that is that it was surrounded by a lot of Black churches. It was close to the transportation, so you had all these docks. So they not only had the products of the slave trade over there, the cotton and the tobacco, but occasionally you would have people trying to liberate themselves and hiding on those ships. And occasionally you'd find things in the Brooklyn Eagle saying, you know, we found a dead body in one of these boats. We don't know how many live bodies were there, but so there are four factors that she thought were, well, four factors why Cheryl LaRoche thought that Duffield was important. So you had the transportation, you had the churches, you had, I'm forgetting one of them, the physical evidence of these buildings. And then the fourth one is one thing that's very interesting about Duffield is you have an oral history. So these stories of the Underground Railroad and this abolitionist survived somehow, some way into the 20th century. And that is something, you know, exciting and unique. So let's see what else. Let me keep going here. I just want to throw in some of these pictures. These were some pictures of the fundraiser we had in 2016. I think one thing, here's my daughter in the picture. You know, we have this amazingly beautiful group of people. These are some part of the extended family of Mama Joy. I mean, this was just an amazing group of people who are carrying the history. I mean, I love, you know, we have here the African xylophone here. You know, these guys are also great at playing the African xylophone. This is just a great dance troupe. I mean, these are just like great, it's a great group of people. Oh, I found this thing here. This was something actually from 223 Duffield, one of the properties that has been destroyed. And you can see the language that they're using, that this is part of the urban renewal phase, that they're using all of this urban renewal to just demolish anything that might have any history. And just a sampling of some of these other things. One of the other things that is important, okay, I'm gonna try to finish this up. There was a huge network of other things here. You have the groups like the Lincoln Center, you have you have organizations like the Settlement Movement, the Urban League, the NAACP. They were all founded in this area. Oh, this is exciting. Here is a picture of Thomas Truesdale. We haven't finished this. This is from the Truesdale family. They have a picture of them. This might be Harry Truesdale. We're not quite sure. This was another picture. We don't even know who these guys. We still need some more research here. I'm going to try to do this. There are some great resources here, which we will share for everyone. Because of our fight in 2003, New York City spent $1 million to save the history, mostly going to this thing, In Pursuit of Freedom. If you don't know about this, please share that. Oh, this is a little bit more on Harry Truesdale. This is a picture of the Philadelphia Hall, the 1838 convention. We have countless videos here, which I will share, countless videos, which I'll be glad to share. But then here is our victory here. So now we're now accepted. You know, this was such a shocking moment here to be in City Hall, you know, after we were such the rebel group, to then be celebrated in City Hall was a little strange, I gotta say, you know, to have, to be a prop for Charlene McRae. I'm glad to do it. She was, I think, very essential in pushing this forward. So here is Shanae Lee, the daughter of Mama Joy, one of her grandchildren. Okay, so now I want to end it up with a call to action. We have a lot of people here who are activists. Like, we save the history. It's people like us right here, right now, who are the ones who save this history. And the next step in this is Willoughby Square Park. So 227 Duffield was going to be destroyed to build this square, Willoughby Square Park. You know, it's 1.15 acres. And because of our efforts, there's supposed to be $1 million dedicated to building a monument to Brooklyn abolitionist history. The Economic Development Corporation does not want to do that. They have a crappy proposal. It whitewashes the history. We have this petition here. I'm going to share this in the chat. I hope everyone signs this petition and shares it. So this explains, I think, really how this history continues. So all of these things that made the 227 Duffield important, they were part of a larger network. And because of these Black churches, these suffrage organizations, the literary societies, they had, you know, the spiritualist movements. They had some kind of wacky things there too, but that community continued. And so in 1892, some of these women who were still active down there, so the children of Sylvana Smith, Sarah Smith Garnett, and Dr. Susan Smith McKinney, and Richard Lyons, one of these other people, they raised money for Ida B. Wells, and they supported her. And they, because of them and some of the important newspapers around them, Ida B. Wells moved to downtown Brooklyn, to Gold Street, off of Willoughby. And, you know, you have these more huge skyscrapers going there. But she moved because of this network of women. And I just want to plug, so Maritza Lyons is this over here. She was a teacher for 48 years in New York City. She also debated Ida B. Wells and won. And after that, they became lifelong friends. And so these were amazing women. So when we want to tell the story, our idea is to build a monument to these people. So a physical thing where anyone, an adult or a 9-year-old child, can go and see these women and kind of touch it and get a sense of that. So we're very dedicated to building this monument here. And I know I'm over time, so I'm gonna leave it there. I'm gonna look forward to all your questions, and hopefully we can continue all of this stuff. And yeah, so let me know what everyone else has to say. But please, the next time, again, there's bureaucratic ways of stopping this history. So the bureaucratic strategy of the Economic Development Corporation to stop this monument is to delay the discussion. They want to delay the discussion until the fall, I suspect, so that they want to build their crappy plan. So I'm hoping that we can get people to come to the next Community Board 2 meeting virtually and ask that they put it on the agenda. So that's my last call to action. And now let me open it up to the greater discussion.
Okay, thank you so much, Ralph, for that. Your passion exudes from you as you speak, and Suzanne, the same. Your presentation was thorough and informative, and you see from some of the responses that inspiring as well. Both of you have done this and have done a great job in recording and preserving the history of our common place, our downtown Brooklyn. And so thank you for that. And we have some time for some questions. If Suzanne and Raul, if you look at the Q&A, the bottom of your screen, you can see the questions come up. You might find some of these, but Raul, could I ask you just to start? You mentioned Joy, and a few times, could you just explain for people who did not know who she was? The person who inspired you in all of this when you first came to New York, Joy Monroe.
So Joy, Mama Joy, as everyone's known her, was living there and really just a.
So she was a resident of.
She was a resident of
227
Duffield. She moved there in, I believe, 1993. It had been, she moved with her husband at the time. The property was actually first, her husband's first wife was the one who first moved there. So actually, and the Truesdales lived, their family lived there until like, I think the 1920s. And so they there wasn't actually a long gap between when the Truesdales moved in and when Mama Joy's family moved in. But she was just she was a force of nature. She was, I met her in February of 2004. We were actually fighting the Atlantic Yards project. And at that time, she was a very outspoken person against eminent domain abuse. Eminent domain is when the government can take private property or public property. Actually, you can use eminent domain to take public property as well for a public purpose. And this eminent domain has become twisted in this very strange sense. And so these fights were combined, and she was definitely a leader of that. She was, she started a whole, she had summer camp. She had her whole family was doing African music ensemble. She was very instrumental in founding the African drum circle in Prospect Park. She was, I don't think I'm really getting at how kind of inspiring and colorful
So in addition to being the resident or a resident owner of that property, she was also the a person who was very active in the active in trying to preserve
yes.
it. Okay, and let's see what kinds of questions we have now.
Mention, she was also one of the main organizations back then was Families United for Racial and Economic Equality, FURY. So there was she was very involved in that. And I think what's going on here?
So what happened is I just saved the screen so we can see some of the questions.
Oh, okay.
So what you see in front of your screen is the some questions.
All right. Actually, I'm seeing the folder. Hold on, let me share this.
Oh, okay. It's not the. I'm sorry. Yeah. Just that your screens. Well, let me ask a question. How were the funds generated to save 227 Duffield Street?
Okay. So sorry. I just shared a folder with my presentation and some other stuff here. You can see in the PowerPoint thing, which I have also as a PDF. If you want to see some videos, I tried, there's all sorts of stuff in there. So we don't have a formal we're just now starting a formal organization. We've tried to have some nonprofits. We did this all for free, we don't we're not getting big bucks from anywhere. A lot of this stuff was really just essentially, you know, if you look at how New York City is structured, like we're basically have been a ragtag group of activists. And now I think, you know, we've been a zero budget thing. We've worked with some groups who've been pretty amazing. I also want to give credit to Equality for Flatbush and Circle for Justice Innovation. So in the last less than 2 years, year and a half, they've really been organizing a lot of this stuff. They have a nonprofit, so we've had some expenses that have come from them. But you know, a lot of the stuff has basically been free. Though
So
right
that
now,
that there are other organizations around the city working for this. And Suzanne, do you you are involved with Crown Heights, and so is there other ways that the you know, that neighborhoods and communities work for historic preservation?
Sure. Specifically for Crown Heights, the Crown Heights North Association was founded in 2002 to get parts of Crown Heights North designated as a Landmarks Preservation Commission historic district. And we worked forever on that. We were able to get three phases landmarked between 2002 and 2013. And we've got one last fourth phase that we're working on now. We've been bugging the heck out of LPC to come over and take a look at what we've got. It's a long process. The main thing is you have to have a lot of organization. You have to have a lot of people willing to do things, and you have to be very patient, and you have to be very persistent. I think you can't give up. You just have to keep bugging them until they do it so that you'll go away. And especially if whatever it is you're trying to get landmarked is truly worthy, either architecturally or culturally or historically. Right now I'm working with the Bowery Alliance of Neighbors, and we're working on getting 134, 136 Bowery landmarked by LPC. That organization is very encouraged by what happened at Duffield Street. The houses on the Bowery were also owned by families who were involved in the abolitionist movement. And so, you know, now's the time. Black people are in, so we have to take advantage of this history and get these things done before the pendulum swings in another direction.
Interesting. Okay, and someone had a question about a Weeksville abolitionist newspaper. Can either of you speak to that?
Yes, they did have a newspaper. Unfortunately, the first page of the first one still exists in print, and Weeksville has a copy of it. It ran for, I believe, at least a year, and I'm not sure on that. I just did a PowerPoint presentation on Weeksville, and unfortunately some things have leaked out of my aging brain and I can't remember all the details, but yeah, they did have a newspaper, and it not only gave news about the African-American community, it also was a primer. It taught people how to read. It had a lot of really useful information.
Okay, and people are asking how to get in touch with you. Perhaps both of you, I think you might have done this, Raul, but if you could just put some contact information, if you would not mind being contacted by people who have been speaking, who have been in the audience today listening.
Yep, I'm putting it in the chat.
Okay, so for our audience, it is in the chat. We've come to the end of our talk, and obviously, Suzanne, you were not exaggerating at the beginning when you said this is a semester's course and we're trying to squeeze it into an hour and a half. But what you and Raul did present was very, very interesting and thoughtful and helpful, and just opening eyes to see all of the possibilities. And as someone is mentioning in one of the Q&As, talking about preserving the home of Eva Taylor and Clarence Williams in Jamaica, Queens, important jazz and early radio history. And so, you know, this does have people think about, you know, preserving history. Things happen in places, and when we keep those places, the memory of what happened there does not disappear, and that is the effort in which you are all engaged. And so remember, audience, that this has been recorded, so so you will be able in several days to go on the BWRC, Brooklyn Waterfront Research Center website, and under the breakfast talks, there will be a way to connect this. Zoom usually puts this up on YouTube, and we'll be able to have it there so you could look at it. And this was very important. And thank you very much, Suzanne and Raul, for your time and your effort in putting this breakfast talk together. And thank everyone for coming and attending. And we should mention that the BWRC, here's a little plug for us, is having our annual conference on art, science, and climate, the climate crisis along the Brooklyn waterfront. That will be on Thursday evening, May 7th, and Friday morning, Thursday evening, May 6th, and Friday morning, May 7th. If you attended this conference, you'll probably are on our email list and will be receiving some notice about it. So again, thank you. And now everybody's waiting. I'm waiting to have the college open again so I could walk by 227 Duffield Street. And so again, so long. Thank you very much. Any
Thank
last
you.
words for Suzanne or Raul? Do you have any comments?
I just want to thank you, Richard, for inviting us and the Brooklyn Waterfront Research Center. This is really exciting for us to be able to be part of this. And yeah, just thank you.
Okay, we hope to work together some more.
I echo what Raul said, and I also want to thank Raul for inviting me to join you. So I'm just excited about all of the opportunities that are out there.
And we did have some City Tech faculty among the audience today, so I would not be surprised to either of you to, sometime in the future get an invitation to speak at a class or something at City Tech.
Anytime. I enjoy doing this very much.
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you everyone, and see you the next time. Bye now.
Thank you.
Bye.